Merci d'être là pour cette 8e séance du séminaire dont vous voyez l'intitulé à l'écran. Donc un séminaire qui se poursuit dans le cadre d'un programme de recherche mené, que je supervise à l'Institut national d'histoire de l'art, en collaboration, programme mené en partenariat avec les archives de la critique d'art à Rennes, la bibliothèque Kandinsky du Centre Georges Pompidou et l'Institut national de l'audiovisuel, avec donc un double objectif. Un premier objectif documentaire de rassembler, de mettre ensemble les fonds d'archives relatifs à la Biennale de Paris possédés par ces trois institutions, et un objectif plus réflexif qui est, même si les deux sont forcément liés, parce que l'objectif documentaire demande une réflexion également, donc un objectif plus réflexif lié à en fait, un travail de recherche et d'interrogation de cette Biennale internationale des jeunes artistes qui a existé entre 1959 et 1985, une période donc très riche en événements politiques, mais aussi en interrogations artistiques, d'où la raison pour laquelle le programme s'appelle 1959-1985 au prisme de la Biennale de Paris. Donc pensez l'époque au prisme de la Biennale, mais pensez aussi cette Biennale qui est très peu étudiée. Voilà, le séminaire a été initié en octobre. Vous avez le petit dépliant à l'entrée qui vous donne les séminaires qui ont eu lieu jusqu'à présent. Il se poursuivra, peut-être pas au même rythme, mais en tout cas avec 2 séances à l'automne et puis ensuite en 2019 aussi, avec comme objectif une publication et éventuellement d'autres choses aussi, mais au fur et à mesure. Alors si vous voulez être tenu au courant de nos activités, il y a une feuille qui va circuler, une feuille d'inscription. Donc vous pouvez vous mettre je ne sais pas qui a cette feuille. Oui. Voilà. Il y a un crayon. Donc si vous voulez mettre votre adresse, vous serez tenu au courant de... Très bien. Donc si vous avez déjà noté, c'est pas la peine. Sinon... Ouais. Voilà. Alors, sans plus tarder, je vais présenter les invités de ce soir. Donc la séance de ce soir va se dérouler en anglais. Je ferai la présentation en français d'abord et puis rapidement en anglais. But I'm very happy to welcome today Alanna Heiss and Richard Nonas, en compagnie de Pauline Chevalier qui va faire la modération. Donc je vais prendre donc Pauline Chevalier, que je remercie énormément pour la préparation de cette séance qui est sur, enfin, Pauline Chevalier fait partie du comité scientifique de ce programme de recherche qui comprend un groupe très dynamique de gens. Et donc cette séance en particulier est réalisée à son instigation et je la remercie très vivement. Alors, Alanna Heiss est directrice de Clockwater Productions. Actuellement, c'est aussi une figure majeure du mouvement radical de création d'espaces alternatifs à New York dans les années 1970, mouvement qui a transformé les pratiques de production, présentation et réception des projets artistiques, particulièrement des projets artistiques in situ et des projets artistiques de grande échelle. En 1972, elle a fondé la légendaire Clockwater Gallery, puis en 1976, PS1 Contemporary Art Center, qui aujourd'hui, comme vous le savez sans doute, fait partie du MoMA, donc c'est le MoMA PS1, donc fait partie du musée d'art moderne de New York. PS1, donc centre internationalement reconnu de production de présentation d'art contemporain, qui n'a pas de collection fixe, donc c'est essentiellement un centre d'exposition. Elle l'a dirigé pendant 32 ans et a organisé à son actif, Alanna Heiss, à plus de 700 expositions, que ce soit à PS1 ou à travers le monde. En 2003, elle a fondé une radio alternative, Art Radio WPS1.org. Donc, c'est une station radio expérimentale sur le web qui continue. Parmi les nombreuses publications qu'elle a dirigées et expositions qu'elle a organisées figurent des catalogues de l'œuvre de Janet Cardiff, Alex Katz, Dennis Oppenheim, Michelangelo Pistoletto, Katharina Sieverding ou encore John Wesley. Alanna Heiss a été l'une des 4 commissaires de la Nouvelle Biennale de Paris, qui est la dernière biennale, en fait, celle de 1985, dont il sera pas mal question, je pense, ce soir. Elle a été aussi la commissaire du pavillon américain à la Biennale de Venise en 1986, la commissaire principale de l'hommage à John Cage à la Biennale de Venise en 1993, la commissaire en chef de la Biennale de Shanghai en 2002. Chevalier des arts et des lettres en France, elle est récipiendaire de nombreux prix aux États-Unis, mais aussi en Suède, ou encore la CCS Bart Award for Curatorial Excellence. Voilà, pour faire court. Donc, I'm very, very grateful to have you here, Alanna. Et à sa droite, Richard Nonas. Richard Nonas commence par, qui est artiste, comme vous le savez, commence par un parcours d'étudiant de littérature et d'anthropologie sociale à l'Université de Michigan, ensuite au Collège de Lafayette, aux universités de Columbia et Caroline du Nord, avant de travailler pendant 10 ans sur le terrain comme anthropologue. Il a travaillé donc en Ontario du Nord, en Mexique du Nord et en Arizona du Sud, avec, en tant qu'anthropologue avec des Indiens d'Amérique. Il se tourne vers la sculpture suite à ce travail d'anthropologue et son travail en reste profondément marqué. En particulier sur l'importance de la perception de l'espace. Je pense que là aussi, il en sera beaucoup question. L'espace, alors l'espace de présentation de l'art, puisque Richard Nonas, dans les années 70, fait partie d'un groupe d'artistes ensemble avec Alanna Heiss, groupe d'artistes et de commissaires qui trouvent et créent des lieux d'exposition alternatifs, mais aussi l'espace de l'œuvre en termes de création. Son travail fait recours à un vocabulaire minimaliste et engage une réflexion sur la notion de lieu, ou en anglais place. Nombre de ses œuvres, réalisées en bois de construction, en poutres linéaires, en pavés de granit ou en plaques d'acier, reposent directement au sol et fonctionnent moins comme des objets esthétiques formels que comme des marqueurs d'espace. Les formes qu'il crée visent à interrompre l'espace, attirent l'attention sur l'absence de spécificité des formes, tout en nous amenant à une perception de l'espace chargée d'émotions et de signification. Richard Nonas a exposé et continue d'exposer et d'intervenir dans le monde entier, aussi bien au sein de musées que beaucoup en fait à l'extérieur de musées, dans des espaces autres. En France, il a réalisé différentes œuvres à Dunkerque, mais surtout dans le village abandonné de Vierre à Digne-le-Bain en 2012. Oui, là, je me rends compte que je n'ai pas pris le bon document. And you're still doing some new projects in Aix, near Aix, or no?
Yeah, about 30 kilometers north of Aix-en-Provence.
Yeah. Et donc, il y a un projet en cours à Aix-en-Provence. Ses dernières expositions personnelles incluent en 2016 The Man in the Empty Space au musée d'art contemporain de Moka de Massachusetts. Et Richard Nonas Reach Out a Way Back au Art Institute de Chicago en 2016-2017. Voilà. Et donc Pauline Chevalier, qui est maître de conférence à l'Université de Bourgogne-Franche-Comté, où elle enseigne l'histoire de l'art et la muséologie. Et depuis 2018, donc depuis très récemment, elle est conseillère scientifique à l'Institut national d'histoire de l'art pour le domaine histoire des techniques et des disciplines artistiques. Elle est responsable d'un programme dédié aux sources visuelles et graphiques des partitions chorégraphiques du XVIe siècle à nos jours. Ses recherches personnelles portent sur les convergences entre littérature, danse, sculpture et images en mouvement, dans l'art américain depuis les années 60, et sur les croisements entre espaces d'exposition et espaces scéniques dans l'art contemporain. Elle est l'auteur, entre autres, de ce livre remarquable qui est paru l'année dernière, qui s'appelle Une histoire des espaces alternatifs à New York, de Soho au South Bronx, 1969-1985. Est-ce que je peux le faire circuler ?
Oui.
Voilà. Et voilà. Donc la séance d'aujourd'hui s'appelle « Les institutions précaires et établies de l'art contemporain ». et leur transformation des années 60 aux années 80. L'idée était d'inviter Alanna et Richard à la fois pour leur engagement dans les espaces d'art alternatifs qui émergent aux États-Unis dans les années 70, mais aussi pour le parcours même d'Alanna qui l'a mené des espaces alternatifs au commissariat des grandes biennales. Et au fait que ces deux types bien qu'en apparence n'ayant rien en commun, les espaces alternatifs et les grandes biennales, ce sont des phénomènes qui marquent cette période des années 60 aux années 80, phénomènes auxquels on aimerait réfléchir. Donc, the precarious and established institutions of contemporary art and their transformation from the 60s to the 80s. Merci beaucoup.
Merci Elitza. Et maintenant, on va passer en anglais, mais on pourra, voilà, aussi pour la discussion qui clôturera la séance, on pourra s'arranger pour qu'il y ait des questions en français. Voilà, ça reste quand même ouvert, mais là, on va discuter en anglais. So I would like first to thank Alanna Heiss and Richard Nonas for coming all the way from New York. And well, you've been in France for a little while before, but thank you for being here tonight, and to share your thoughts and experiences, both in terms of site-specific works and biennials and the projects, and also your collaborations. You've been working together for several decades, so we're very happy you're here together to discuss biennials and other projects. And as an introduction, I would like to start with the image we use for tonight's session. This is.
Shall we sit there?
Yes.
To see the slides?
Yeah. If those are the slides I gave you as well but whatever is.
I like to see them on the screen.
Okay. Well, and then you'll come back right after my introduction. Okay. Good. Because that's not the point of talking all by myself. Yes, this image of Georges Boudaille, who was talking to journalists right in front of this work by John Ahern, called Back to School, or Casting a 7-year-old Janelle in the Bronx from September 1983. John Ahern is an American artist known for his live plaster cast of Bronx residents in the 1980s. He worked closely with the community of the South Bronx, casting kids and their parents, and always making his sculptures, always making 2 copies, one for the models and one for the exhibition, usually outside on the walls of the neighborhood, just like here in the South Bronx. Or here with bright colors. And here, this is a picture of John Ahern and Tom Artones, who also participated in the biennial, and Rigoberto Torres, and with Stephen Haynes and Joel Lewis in the background. This is at Fashion Moda, Fashion Moda, there's a typo. And this was an alternative space from the Bronx that opened in the late 70s. And so John Ahern was working there. And his work shown outside, like this one, was with bright colors, mixing both tradition of Hispanic sculptures and also contemporary interest with the portrait and the image. And John Ahern was also a founding member of Collab and organizer of the Times Square show in 1980. And his first solo show was at Fashion Moda in the Bronx, and his second was in Germany in 1982. In 1984, he was invited by Casper Koenig, one of the 4 international curators of the Paris Biennial in 1985. Casper Koenig did not only invite German artists, and this relationship between artist invitation and nationalities was rather ambiguous during the selection process of the biennial, and we will definitely get back to that. This is one of the points that we would like to discuss, nationalities and the selection process. John Ahern also meant to exhibit his work closely to communities he was working with, and the text in the catalog from the biennial mentions him He studied at Cornell and set up studios in situations such as bowling alleys, elementary schools, and nursing homes, where his relation with his subject was one of exchanging work for sittings. So sculptures and portraits, but sculptures that could be seen as site-specific works, meaning that he was working with a neighborhood and he was usually exhibiting in a neighborhood. This is not exactly what happened in Paris, because in Paris, he sent a sculpture for the show, and he was not sure, like looking at the archives and the correspondence with Georges Boudaille, he was not sure he would be able to make it before the opening, so he sent a sculpture, and it didn't work with people in Paris. And this ambivalence of the work is quite meaningful for that Paris Biennial in 1985, where new images, figurations, site-specific works, sculptures were mingled in a very eclectic show, set up in the Grande Halle de la Villette. So we will go back to this site-specific idea for the Biennale in 1985. And with several questions, and one of them being, how can a biennial with a very specific setting, such as the Grande Halle de la Villette, provide a space and an ideal framework for site-specific works? And so we will discuss the terms themselves, site-specific. And how a biennial, such as the Paris Biennial, could relate to the international movement of criticism towards art institutions, museums, and galleries, with the experimentation of new spaces for contemporary art. And so we will not only look at the Paris Biennial of 1985, where Alanna Heiss was one of the 4 international curators, but also discuss some artist-run spaces and other alternative venues and their relations to international biennials or events such as Documenters or the Venice Biennale. And regarding the history of the Biennale de Paris, if we look at several ones, for example, 1971, the same year as many alternative spaces in New York were opening their doors, the Biennale de Paris opted for a specific exhibition setting. This is what Jean Nouvel wrote for the catalogue. He said that visitors who were familiar with Parisian museums and exhibitions have the right to be surprised in 1971. Why? Well, because they are no longer at the Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, with its marble floors, but in a warehouse, with concrete blocks, cast iron columns, and uneven concrete floors. So nothing in the exhibition setup reminds a museum or a more traditional exhibition setup. And this is, and Jean Nouvel wrote about the fact that in 1971 they explicitly they choose a space that was raw and that could also, he explains that there were both aesthetic and financial reasons for that. But it's interesting to see that in 1971, this process for the Biennale de Paris was also exactly contemporary to what happened in New York at the exact same time. Then in 1975, and also in 1977, several artists who participated in the Biennale de Paris, American artists, were artists who started their careers at 112 Green Street, one of the very first alternative spaces. And these alternative spaces where Richard Nonas was very active, was one of the main artists who helped starting all these spaces, especially 112 Green Street. Just showing you here this image of Jean Hastings, Human Scale Black. This is actually a work that was done for the 1975 Biennale de Paris, and then destroyed after the Biennale, and then that was redone for the Guggenheim Museum, and a text for the catalogue in 1975. And Jean Hastings was one of these artists who was very active in alternative art spaces, such as 112 Green Street, but also spaces that... Right, and your ex-husband. And also, he was very active in several spaces you found it. So that was an example, and here an example of what he was showing at 112 Green Street, right before the 1975 Biennale de Paris.
And that is 112 Green Street.
Yes, that's at 112 Green Street.
At its cleanest point.
Right. Another example to remind you that in 1975, this very famous work by Gordon Matta Clark was done in the context of the Paris Biennale, meaning that, and also there's quite a few interesting letters between Gordon Matta Clark and Georges Boudaille about this project, where Gordon Matta Clark is explaining how he will try to find a place to work, not show work in the museum or in the exhibition space, but directly to work with the building in Paris.
I'd just like to say there was enough collaboration between New York and Paris so that at this time I was doing a show in a building directly across the street from Gordon while he was doing this. Yeah.
Right in front of the Centre Pompidou was still in construction. Yes. And oops, that's after. So some artists from 1970 and 1985 also had shown their work at several spaces that Alanna Heiss founded, and we will go back to this history also of these different spaces. But the urban dimension and site-specific works of the biennials are striking for some events and quite ambiguous for 1985 in a very different artistic context. The mid-1980s witnessed several changes in the art scene in Paris and in New York. Alternative art spaces are partially declining due to the lack of financing, and also alternative galleries emerge in the Lower East Side and East Village with new practices, and especially the rise and the renewal of painting. And this is also something we'll talk about, painting in relation to the market. And the Paris Biennial reflects this change in 1985, the power of the art market, the persistence of site-specific works, and the strong presence of painting. So in the first part, we will discuss Alanna Heiss and Richard Nonas' careers and experiences and collaborations regarding alternative spaces and biennials. And then in the second part, we will focus mostly on the 1985 Paris Biennale, and we'll see a few excerpts of a film made by Jeff Cornelis. But first, let's start with this first part on alternative institutions. Well, if I can say so, alternative institutions. So spaces that opened in the late 1960s and early 1970s and allowed artists to experiment with space, nude practices, and quite a freedom in the margins of galleries and museums. And not against them, but in relation to them. So Alanna Heiss, you founded PS1 in 1976, but PS1 was part of a larger project, and a project that started earlier with the Institute for Art and Urban Resources, a project responsible for so many innovative spaces and exhibitions, such as here the Brooklyn Bridge show. So, well, you showed your work, Richard, and here is a flyer of the event where the list of artists who participated, and I also wanted just to show an image. A photograph by Richard Nonas of the pig roast party that happened also on the Brooklyn Bridge at that moment.
But the pig roast was a sculpture.
Right, that was part of the.
It was not a party.
It was a sculpture.
Well, the party was a sculpture.
But it was still a party.
Yeah. What?
It was still a party.
But the party was the sculpture.
The party was the sculpture, right?
No, I'm talking about site-specific. It's not the object, necessarily. Here, the piece was the participant eating the pig and cooking the pig. That was the sculpture.
Right.
Okay.
And just to show a few images of other spaces that Alanna founded, just like 10 Blicker, for example. And also the clock tower. Oh, maybe we'll go back to this. And PS1 in this abandoned school in Queens. And I choose this, also this article because John Russell here compares PS1 with documentaire. So maybe as a first question, and before asking Richard Nonas about these different spaces and how he exhibited in his work in there, maybe Alanna, you can remind us how you were inspired in setting up these spaces and the Institute for Art and Urban Resources, and what goals you had in mind, and if actually documenter or events such as documenter were in your mind at that time, or had a role in shaping the identity of these spaces.
That's a question?
Well, maybe just like
No,
as an
let's-
introduction,
no,
just
let's
to
talk.
remind us how you started this different
By the way,
projects.
in support of Richard's statement about the pig roast and it being the party was the piece, in fact, you can dispute this, Richard. The pig roast did not produce a very edible pig. Although Gordon was a very good cook, this was not the occasion of one of his good, successful dinners.
But
And
we were hungry enough, so
people
we
were
ate it.
very hungry, but a number of people got sick. Did you know that?
No, I didn't. I didn't.
You didn't get sick. Well, you have a stomach of iron. But, you know, it was intended, Gordon intended to be something that everyone would share, almost like a communion in a sense. But he was pretty nervous about people eating it because of the certain conditions in which it was cooked under. It was cooked for so long, but it had to be cooked less long than it should have been because of the intervention that happened by a number of gangs who haunted the area underneath the bridge and kept chasing people off. There were some gangs in New York were dangerous and some were not dangerous. These gangs were a little bit dangerous. And in order to do the show, I had to have protection. And I couldn't strike a deal with the gangs. So I struck a deal with the mafia, who had a very large operation going on under the bridge called Colonial Cement. Colonial Cement, what a good name. Colonial. Like at the beginning of America, the vision of the dream of people coming to America as immigrants and building substantial businesses, supporting their many children and becoming entrepreneurs and American businessmen. Our Colonial Cement, which was quite successful, was largely engaged in helping things disappear under a lot of cement. And it was also successful, but it was not ever be listed under any entrepreneurial list of companies. So I went to Colonial Cement, and one of my few really good fundraising opportunities, I asked them for money to help do the show, and then they said they didn't want to give that much money, so I asked them for protection, which was they were very, very happy to give, because they liked art, because they're Italian. And they said, we like art, we're Italian, you know? And they didn't like the gangs who were primarily Hispanic, I think. Anyway, so that's just a note. Elisa, thank you so much for inviting me. And also thank you for, I hate the expression, thinking outside of the box. It's just like a horrible, banal expression, but thank you for thinking of inviting Richard Nonas and me, because we've been having this discussion our whole lives. And to continue it under the auspices of you and your very prestigious series with the formerly young, unknown interviewer who is now the author of this huge book, which she tried to tell me was so heavy because of the paper. Imagine such a bad excuse. It's so heavy, a lot of because of the paper they used. It's just a big book, Pauline, and you did it.
And what about the history of the this?
It's going to become a motion picture.
Right.
Yes.
Maybe we can discuss that.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, yes, okay. So she wants me to get back, but I do have to also say, of the people who came today in the rain and the strikes, we also, Richard and I, visitors to this wonderful, friendly country, friendly to art for so long, and friendly to us for so long. Thank you for coming through the rain. And also, did Nicholas make it here? Yes or no, Nicholas? Okay, that's the guy who interviewed me, and now he's off. Did Sophie make it here? There she is. Okay, you're on, Sophie. Did the Norwegian air shuttle girl who sat next to me on the plane last night and had fallen in love with a Frenchman, is she here? No, she didn't make it. Okay.
Great.
If you remember your question, just go back to it.
I'd like to point out that one of the reasons Alanna was able to do all these spaces, you just got a demonstration of. She's an expert on changing the subject, an expert on finding people to ask for money who would never, ever think about giving money, but really just want to get involved with Alanna. And that's the way all these things happen.
Yeah.
Well, and you were able to set up like so many spaces that were both for exhibition purposes, but also providing artist studios, and maybe like just regarding PS1 and this comparison with Documenter, does it make any sense for you? Just this comparison at that time in 1976?
It certainly made sense at the time, except for a couple of pretty interesting differences. Documenta was then, and still is today, the most lavishly funded exhibition in the world. In the world. And the organizers of Documenta are appointed after a search of a year. There's a discussion that happens in the confines and sanctuaries of the German intellectual and political power groups. And they choose a director of Documenta, and that director is given 5 years to make this biggest show on earth. And they're given more money than any show on earth. And what's to come out of that is to be a defining show which absolutely brings the entire world up to date with what the progress and the achievements of contemporary art within the last 5 years, yes, but also within the last 30 years. Every curator of Documenta passionately believes that they have the opportunity to correct the misconceptions, the mistakes, to promote the great works that have happened during the course of their lifetime, not just 5 years.
They're all wrong.
They're all wrong. And they're all wrong. So the difference between that and the PS1 show, where we had less money than any show on earth, less money per artist than any show on earth, and was it 8 weeks? I think it was maybe 2 months. We're talking. Yeah, anyway, there are these very radical shifts in numbers and change, but the vision and the megalomania was the same. Absolutely the same. It is my opportunity to correct the exhibition failures particularly the United States. We won't even talk about France because France had no exhibition successes. This is a problem which is being addressed now by historians to try to understand if that actually was true, and if it was true, why it was true, and how it cannot be true for the future of France. But there was a tremendous sense of insecurity in France. What had happened to Paris, the place of all artistic enterprise and vision? Why were these young Americans, like Richard Nonas and his friends, taking over Europe, particularly Germany? England was not to be discussed because there wasn't anything going on in England. But France thought that it should be the center, and its Paris Biennale, which you're going to steer us into later, had been the only viable weapon, venue, call it something, that existed. There were very few French dealers who functioned on an international scale. There were very small number of French collectors who bought internationally work by the kind that the Swiss and the Germans and the Americans and the Italians were all buying. The French artists had no collectors like Count Pons de Bohème. The French had no collectors like the great Swiss and German collectors, and no American collectors. So anyway, there was this strange feeling in France. We're here, we're the greatest cultural nation in the world. We have dialogues with the American artists, but we don't have anything really going on.
And Richard, you also exhibited in France several times. I mean, maybe you could go back to the fact that you've exhibited a lot in these alternative spaces and what it meant for you, and maybe also what it meant to constantly coming to France to exhibit your work.
Well, you know, I want to tell you something first about Alanna. Alanna, as she said, was married to a sculptor at that time, part of our group of friends, and we used to get together quite often. I mean, we all lived downtown in Manhattan, and we would eat and drink and smoke and bitch, complain, as most artists do. And what did we complain about? We complained about the fact that we didn't have enough galleries, we didn't have big enough studios. And one day, after years of this, Alanna stood up at one of these parties. She banged on the table and she said, "I'm tired of listening to this stuff. That city is full of empty places. Go and find one. Talk your way into it." And in fact, she began to do that. And that is, in my memory, the way all of this started. And the interesting thing is that because I had been an anthropologist for 10 years, was 5 years older than most of my friends who were in the same place as artists, same generation of artists as I am.
Excuse me, this is the reason that Richard could not be in the Paris Biennale.
That's right, I was too old. The earliest ones were for artists under 35. I was 36.
He was
And
36.
the rule changed in 1985, and things
And I was his
and
best
we'll-
friend,
yeah,
but I
we'll
couldn't
go
get
back.
him in. We'll
Right.
talk about that later.
That's later, yeah. But because I was older and I had never studied art, I was really anxious to see the work that I was making, big pieces, in another space. And so a week or so after Alanna made this great statement, I, at a very similar evening, made my great statement. And I said, I'm going to make my own show. I had no idea what that meant. I had no idea how to do that. And none at all. But about a week later, Alanna called and said, I found a space for you. And I said, take it. And she said, no, wait a second. There was a fire there. The floor is all broken. There's no electricity. I said, doesn't matter. Take it. It's in the middle of nowhere. Doesn't matter. Take it. We took it. Alanna talked her way into this, and we made this show in a big, empty industrial space. We had no money at all. The first thing that happened was one of our friends was working in a gallery, and he said, if you print an announcement, I'll put it through the mailing house of the gallery without telling the gallery. So the mailing will be free. With stamps. The second thing that happened was one day when I was walking to clean up this mess in the gallery, I met a friend who said, I wrote a letter to Rauschenberg telling him what you're doing. And I forgot to mail it. I forgot to give it to him. I said, okay, put it under his door. And that night, Bob Rauschenberg called me and said, come to the studio. I went there and he gave me $1,000 to do this show. No money, no organization, but the only rich artist we knew, successful artist we knew, gave us money without our asking for it. In a space where there was no electricity, no level floor, no way to clean out the garbage in it, we just pushed it into a corner, and we made the show. And it was the first indoor show that Alanna made, and my first one-person show. But that's what New York was like then. And we were basically ignoring the galleries. I mean, basically we decided we don't need the gallery. They don't want us, we don't need them. And we made our own spaces.
And you've been exhibiting also in biennials and more different venues. And how did you feel about the difference between
I've
exhibiting?
never seen a group show that worked. Never. I've helped hang them with Alanna. Group shows are mythological beasts, you know, with the head of a lion and the tail of a donkey. And they remind me always of automobile showrooms. This is the convertible, this is the four-door
That's a very interesting idea, Richard.
What?
That's an interesting idea of
Yeah.
automobile showrooms.
That is to say, they are ways to show, they're like zoos, animals out of the context in which they belong. And I feel that very strongly. You know, some are better than others. I learn things. I see works I never saw before, but I'm seeing them in the wrong place.
Naturally, I disagree with you. But I have a different villain in a group show. I think the group show, installing group shows are very, very, very hard. And how good a show can look depends on who you invite. I know that sounds obvious. It's not obvious. Depending on the magic of that and which piece you end up with. This is all it's supposed to be mystical, but it's actually involved a lot with interior decorating, an idea of how things will look in the future. But one of the huge reasons that group shows don't work, usually ever, is because there's this dream that curators have that there's going to be a motif, a reason for the show that they think of because they're so smart, because they're, really God, and they're going to get the chance to have this, to be the person who unites this work. So that's why curators love group shows, because it makes them into more important than the artist, and they're the uber artist. And also because it's true that the great curators of the past, the people I idolize, most of all Harold Zeman, would come up a couple times in their life with a show which would just change the perception of everyone as to what art was about. And such a show was, When Attitudes Become Form, of course. And so when we actually got the point, when an attitude becomes a form. I mean, it took me about a year and a half thinking about that, and I saw the show 20 times. But I really understood that I had understood something quite different on every. Before that, I had sort of jelly understanding of this, but with this show, it just put the pieces of bread together, and I could chew on a sandwich of art idea, and I understood it, and that's the dream. The dream of a curator is to do that show. And maybe you do one your whole life, maybe you do 3. For me, my show like that, where I changed the world with this show, I was the person who did it, got the show going. Of course, I didn't make the art. But the name of the show was Rooms, which people talk about all the time. The catalog sells on eBay. My whole life has been spent talking about the room show when I'm in a room like this. Say, what about the room show? Anyway, that's my show. I'm lucky to have had one show. I did some more that were pretty important, not ever as important as the room show, but were pretty important. That's the dream that curators have, and that's why we make you do group shows.
Yeah. Well, I agree with you. And it seems to me that those shows that work because it's no longer a group show, it's a single thing. That is, the show becomes the art. The show is the complex piece of art. But if the idea of the show is to show my work, your work, your work, and your work, that never works for me. But if those can come together and be the parts of a larger thing in itself, that a world in itself, that's when it works.
When I figured out that I wasn't going to hit these big ideas all the time, which is something most curators employed today don't know. They still think that every show they do may be that definitive show. But I knew within the first day that this wasn't going to happen to me. Because why? Because Richard told me, because all of these people told me, Alanna, grow up. This isn't going to be a definitive show. And I changed, and I did something brilliant, which was I tried to get names for shows which said nothing except the description. And that's why the Bleecker Street show was called 5 Sculptors, 7,000 Square Feet. And my whole life I've attempted to duplicate the neutrality of that statement. Any of your young curators, I beg you to think about those things.
The room show that Alanna did was in fact a great show. But it was a great show because of several things. One, the most important thing was it was this old school building. The roof had been leaking for 10 or 15 years. There was still water on the floors. It was a ruin. And what she did was she invited 30, I think it was 30, wasn't it?
Oh, no, it was many, many, many more, Richard.
Anyway, a lot of artists who she respected. And what she said was, pick any space in the building you want and do anything you want, but there's no money. And what happened was, the show, in fact, was about the building, about a building transformed. It wasn't about the work of just Vito and the work of Richard and the work of Jean. And it was about how this building had been transformed into something else by the work of all of those people. And it held together. And it still holds together in the catalog. And that's extraordinary. But the reason it did hold together was because the building was crummy enough and powerfully wounded enough so that was as important in itself as any of the work was.
I love the idea of a wounded building. It's really beautiful. You should know, those of you, and I'm not being sarcastic, that Richard also is a beautiful writer and a kind of poet. And one of his things that he loves to do is make books. So if you ever have the chance to see, you're in a bookstore, it would be worth stealing one of those books or just removing it. And through the years, by reading his books, I've actually learned more than, I'm sorry to say, from, art critics. But I'm looking forward to reading your book because it's all about the things I worked on. So I know that it'll be great. One thing that was a confusion between 112 and Clock Tower, the Institute for Art and Urban Resources was a pretentious name, carefully chosen, so that the police, when they're trying to give a ticket or arrest you, they start out always, name, but we knew that they couldn't get to the end of the name and remember the beginning of the name. If those people in the room whose English is their first language will know that there's something slightly off about the Institute of is fine, and then of art, yes, okay, that's okay. And what? And urban resources. Well, urban resources is not in the same noun category as art. So that was deliberate, so that they'd say art and urban, art and resources. Anyway, that's one reason. The second reason was to allow it to be a foundation which took on many different spaces at the same time, and that unlike 112, which had one space, my plan was to pull in different buildings all the time according to the art that we wanted to do the show with. We being, not we, Queen Victoria and me, but we being Richard and the many other artists who I worked with. Not in the same gang. I wouldn't always work with the same gang. 112 Green Street was a club, primarily boys club, and they had a lot of fun and they were a gang. I was part of that gang, but I also, in my club, had lots of artists who weren't part of that gang, and that was a very big, different thing about what I ran, and I'm just saying that because I wanted to say it. But the Institute was a plan that we could have, at one point I had 7 buildings going at the same time. That's a lot. And it was so many, and such a bitch, that I decided to stop because it had become very popular to do this all over the United States, which is a sign of success. I wanted that to happen. I wanted to get rid of all the buildings and get one big building and run it and do a new project. The new project was about how to run an anti-museum. That's what PS1 was. It was not an alternative space. It was an anti-museum. It was big enough. It was strong enough. And I had a 20-year lease. It was worth putting electricity in. And it was worth doing those things and getting the artists to invest their energies and make work for this over, we knew we had 20 years. So I've changed in my life. I stopped being a guerrilla warrior. I stopped being young. And I had to grow up and know that this would be my responsibility and my building for 20 years. And that's a very, very different way of looking at things, from being a street warrior to being a grown-up who wants to start a long-term political fight with the powers that be. And that's the difference. Now, Richard, after 10 years, tried to get me to leave it. He said, if you don't leave now, you won't be able to leave, and you won't be able to do more important shows and things like that. And I said, we fought over this, but I said, it's more important that I keep this anti-museum going than it is to continue to do all these shows. I'll do my shows outside of PS1, my big shows in Paris, in Germany, in Spain. I went around the world doing other shows, which we're going to come to in a second. The whole issue of space, how you use it, where you get it, why you have to have it, what it looks like, and what you put in it, is what all of these issues that we're discussing through this series that you've organized about art. And every city, every country, every group of artists has to find its solutions to these issues of space and how they use it. Museums are, in most cases, not the answer.
And so that's a perfect transition to then maybe look a little closer to how the space of the Grande Halle de la Villette was used in 1985, and also how this group show was organized, and we'll go through the space itself and the selection process for the 1985 Biennale. Just a few things on this Biennale de Paris, 13e Biennale de Paris. This was there was a few big changes. There was first, the name was different. It was the Nouvelle Biennale de Paris, and the main rule was different, meaning that you didn't have to be under 35 to be able to exhibit there. And also, the French government gave a lot of money. We've just been talking about money. That's quite important also for this 1985
Next to
Biennale.
Documenta, it was the equivalent of lunch. Next to the budget for Documenta, the entire budget for the La Villette show was like lunch.
Right.
I'm sorry to say this. That's how massive the German commitment was. And the French were intimidated, the French politicians, by French cultural policy, who said, how can you sit by and watch our neighbors, the Germans, pour this kind of commitment, national commitment, into this Documenta show? You have to give our organizers some real money, and that's how they came up with it.
And this is what also I will include a few excerpts of this movie by Jeff Cornelis, who this is a 1 hour long movie, but I chose a few excerpts. And this is the introduction, and this is actually mentioned several times, how the Paris Biennale is able to compete, or to at least have a big show that is similar to Documenta, and we'll discuss the financial also issues with the Paris Biennale.
So you're going to show this movie?
Not, this is just like a 2-minute. So maybe before we go back to this idea of space and the Grande Halle de la Villette, maybe, Alanna, you could tell us a bit how you got involved in this 1985 Biennale, and maybe we could also go back to the selection process, how it worked, and how did the committee work to reach a consensus, because you were 4 international curators with Casper Conning.
We were 3.
Gérald Gassiot-Talabot.
No, he's not international. He was the French. There were
Oh,
2.
right. Okay, 3 international and 1 French. Sorry. Right.
No. There was also a woman named Anne.
And yeah, but the curators invited for the committee, they're listed as you, Alanna Heiss, and Gérald Gassiot-Talabot, and Casper Conning, as well as Achille Bonito Oliva.
But I'm just, the votes were the votes. And so there were 5 voting people. 5?
Yeah.
Yes. So there are 5 votes, and the French, this has been fought over for a year before any of us were invited. The 3 international curators, Casper, Achille, and me, could, if we all voted together, outvote the French. The French were 2. So the French had, obviously, 2 votes. But for the three so-called star curators to outvote the French, we all had to agree, the star curators. Boudai and his friends felt that there was very unlikely that Caspar, Achille, and I would absolutely agree enough that we would gang up on the French. See, obviously, if we had, we could have just done this whole show in about 2 weeks. But no, so the show took 2 years to organize. We would meet once a month in Paris. I would fly over from New York, be exhausted, hungover, terrified, completely unable to speak one word of French except for hors d'oeuvre. Caspar would take a leisurely train from Germany. Achille would be here for a month before anyway because he's Italian and he'd like to come to Paris. Anyway, and then the French would leave their jobs in the morning and come for coffee and do that and then go away. So every month or every month and a half, every 6 weeks, we would go over lists and lists and lists of artists and have discussions. It was very much the case that a person was not responsible, a curator was not responsible for only proposing American artists or only proposing German artists. We were all able to propose artists from any countries we wanted to. It was supposed to be anti-passport, anti-nationalism. Obviously, by the end of the second year, we had knives and passports, flashlights to examine the passports to see if they were real and so on, because it got down to very, very strong national fights. But the selection procedure was very utopian. And the French, 2 curators of the French were completely uninvolved because they were not interested in any of the art that we were proposing. So for them it was, I don't know what kind of job, I don't know why they took it, I suppose it's a political thing, no idea. If Boudai and his committee had wanted to set up a controversial situation where real discussions were held about the artists with the French, they would have brought in 2 curators who would have been able to have such a discussion. But they deliberately didn't do that because they knew that the French curators would fight to keep only French artists in the show, because that was the attitude at the time. You fought for your country, it was your job, you fought for your country. And Caspar and I believed that we didn't have that job. We believed that we were not representing countries, that we were representing art. Achille knew that he was representing Italy, and he was representing Italian artists, and he was representing a small group of Italian artists who he backed, and he was going to get paid according to the artists he got in from these galleries and these collectors, and so he was just having a good time. As long as he got all of his group of artists in, he didn't care. And then he was, because Achille is very, very smart and super informed, he was then actually participating in these discussions about the other artists going on. So he was a real member of the group. But he didn't have the fake belief like Caspar and I did that we were representing art. This is a perfect opportunity to tell you what was really going on about the Schnabels. So, Schnabel was not my favorite artist. When he was trying to get shows, he put his slides in between the bread in a hamburger, not without the cheese. I ordered a cheeseburger. He was a cook at a restaurant called Max's, Kansas City, and he put his slides in the cheeseburger. He took out the cheese, he put the slides in, and it was delivered to me. My hamburger was, and then suddenly I realized there were slides in there. I opened it up, there were slides by Julian Schnabel, and I really found it offensive. So I didn't show him, and later on, Time magazine, Robert Hughes said the only good thing that Alanna Heiss did in her entire life was to not show Julian Schnabel, right? Of course, immediately reading that, Julian and I were on the phone with each other immediately and proceeded to plan many, projects together. But Schnabel was important to have in this show. Of course he would be in the show, and certainly Caspar and I agreed on this. Achille, as will soon become obvious, agreed also. I went and borrowed 2 very special schnabels that we needed. We needed the broken plate because the show deserved the pieces that had made Julian famous. And I had to get one of the black velvet ones with the deer antlers that come out like that. And I had to get a broken plate. And they were at that time considered very valuable. So I had to go to very big time New York collectors and borrow them, which I did. And they had to have special crates. And they had to have special walls built, both of them, because the plates were really, really heavy. And another point, we may talk about the walls, but I have to take a tranquilizer before I talk about the walls. And so these special walls were built for both Schnabel and another one for David Solly in another part of the place. Now, there's a villain in this story, and his name is Achille Bonito Oliva. There's another villain, and his name is Daniel Templin. Now, Daniel Templin, I'm going to say this at this meeting, and I may decide that this should be taken out because I'm not interested in another lawsuit, but Daniel Templin had done a show of Julian Schnabel's that was it was in Julian's, what Julian called his beige period. I don't know how many people in this room who are French know what beige is, but it's really dull color. And in Julian's case, it looked like vomit. And there was a huge show at Daniel Templin, probably 83, I think, I'm not sure. I surely saw the show. And it was these beige paintings, these vomit paintings. And they had almost nothing on them. They were, but they weren't good minimal paintings. They were awful, awful paintings. It was a mistake. Everybody realized it. No one bought them. They were put away in a warehouse somewhere in Paris. In Paris. So when this Biennale came forward, Templin, I'm making this up because I wasn't in his mind, but he's thinking, oh great, Schnabel's going to be in the show. I can get rid of the beige paintings, right? So Templin, I liked Templin had some grit. He got around. He was one of the dealers who liked to show international artists. He called me up and he said, "Alanna, it's just so great. You show Schnabel." I said, "No, Danielle, I'm going to show the velvet paintings and the and the broken plate paintings because this is not a time to introduce new work by Julian." He said, "Oh, but the beautiful band." I said, no, I saw that show, Danielle. I saw that show. No. So he went to Casper. Casper just laughed. He went to Achille. Achille didn't laugh. Daniel Templin convinced Achille to replace the Schnabel paintings with his paintings. Now, that, of course, didn't work because even the French curators, Garcia Talbot and Anne Tranche, went, what? Because the next morning, there were these paintings, these beige paintings. They were sitting in La Villette. They'd been moved in without transport, without anything, without anybody involved from the staff. And they just arrived and they were leaning against the wall. And the French were looking at that. I came in. I always come in late because I'm always out late. I'm always, hungover. And said, what are those doing there? And I thought, oh my God, Templin got those paintings in here. And oh man, we got to get these out fast. Because the problem in a big international show like this is you can plan your whole life, but when it gets down to the last 11 days, things got to get hung. And things get hung. And crazy things happen, so you have to be like really alert, especially if there are a couple of curators, really. So I'm really alert. Oh my God, I got to get rid of those beige Schnabels, right? And then I grabbed a couple of people, artists, Keith Haring being one of them. I said, we got to move these out of the way here. So he moved them away. Achille had put them all down, like one whole row of them, like there were like 10 of them or something, maybe only 8, I don't know. There were more you'd ever imagine in your life there were. So we turned them around and moved them into another corridor. Achille comes back and he sees no Schnabels, right? He thinks they've been stolen. Only Achille would think that anyone would steal these paintings, only Achille. But of course, he knew right away that they hadn't been stolen. He knew that somebody had done something and that somebody was probably going to be me or Casper. It wasn't Casper. So there was a huge stink over this. And what they're trying to ask Achille about It's why there's this hang-up, because the big novels had not arrived from New York yet. You see, that was my problem. I hadn't to have them to hang yet. I didn't have them. So there were these other novels literally in the wings. It's an English expression. It's usually used for actors. He's waiting in the wings. Well, there were these paintings, and this happened with a couple of different artists in this show, but this was a blatant thing, and that's why that's a big fight. And Achille is trying to say, America can't come first. We've got to hang these novels. We got to get it done now, folks. And Casper's saying, you know, Achille. And, as always, these things come down. Who's willing to really fight? I was willing to fight, and I did fight. And that was a huge fight. It was one of the biggest fights of my life.
And you were also fighting in terms of the selection process to include more women in the show. And this is something quite striking. There's not so many women in there in the show. Susan Rothenberg was invited, but you tried also to have Louise Bourgeois in the show.
Oh, I wasn't trying to get like a lot of women in the show. I was trying to get a few women in the show. Not a lot, just, maybe. I mean, we're going to have, 100 artists in the show? I thought we should have like 10. Maybe 1 or 2 more. So we were desperate for 2 things in this show that my memory is very strong about this, and also very, very, I still wake up sometimes with dreams about this. And I've done 10, 15 biennales since then. I've done Venice 3 times. I've done Shanghai. I still wake up with a nightmare, which is we needed good French artists. We just needed them desperately because we believed that France was a good place to make art, and we wanted people to admire the Paris Biennale to show French artists. Yeah, we're not evil. We were not trying to say French had no artists, but we needed them. And so there's no more than, Daniel Buren. We had to find a lot more of Daniel Buren's, and there were around French artists. But then came the problem with the French curators because they didn't like any of the new French artists. They liked the older French artists. So, this was going to be hard. And George Boudai liked really old French artists. George found out one time during a panel meeting that one of his proposals had died the year before. And he was just dumbstruck. He was like, he died. Any more? Oh, no. This was a guy who was like 85. And, George was still behind him. But I had a very, very close friend who's a French artist, whose name is Emmanuel Pereire. He's now dead, too. And he was so close. And I knew I could get him in because we needed French artists so badly. But the truth is, I tried for almost 2 years to get Emmanuel Pereire in this show, and I couldn't get him through. I tried everything. I went the route of the French curators because Emmanuel is very out of style. I thought, they like that. And also there had been an essay written about him by one of those French intellectuals, one with the long names. I thought, oh, that's great. Couldn't get him in. Couldn't get my best friend in France into the show. And I couldn't get in my best friend in the United States, Richard Nonas. Not sure why. I think the reason was because the French didn't care. I could get their votes. But so for some reason, Casper wasn't interested in your work. And Achille didn't give a shit. Richard Nonino. He wasn't anyone that Achille was interested in. Also, Richard was in the collection of Ponza de Buemo. He was part of the Torino collectors crowd. He was part of anybody Germano Celant would have been his curator. So that's a no vote there. So I couldn't get Richard in. And so these things accumulate. You think, I can do it. But in these 2 cases, remarkably, I couldn't. But I knew I had a winner with Louise Bourgeois because she was French and she was a woman. She's what we call a twofer. A twofer, the only thing better is if she'd been handicapped. And if she'd been handicapped, which I ended up suggesting she was, not saying she was, suggesting she was, she still didn't get in. And why couldn't I get Louise Bourgeois in that show? I'll never know. I'll die not knowing. But Casper and Achille kept saying, we just don't, Alanna, you're on the wrong track here. You're just on the wrong track. She's not ours, she's yours. If the 2 French will vote for her, fine, you can get her in, but we're not voting. And the two French, I don't know why they wouldn't vote. I just don't know. So that was one of the kinds of failures that, as a curator, I know that if I had been more skilled at that time, like I was years later, with build-up and presentation. For instance, you'd never present this at the beginning of a day. You'd present it at the very end when people were leaving and ready, trying to get on, or you just move it in, and you'd present papers that were underneath other papers, and then you'd go and have private meetings with a curator and have drinks with them, and you'd talk about 3 other artists before, and then you'd sneak your artists in. And so I'm just like this. They do the same thing to me. This is not, I'm not a Christian person curator. I'm just bad. People do that to me. They present it to me, at a bar after dinner. I say, oh yeah, it looks pretty good to me. Yes, I agree. But that was a failure. And Susie Rothenberg, who was very popular with those horse paintings, Achille liked them immediately. Antrange kind of liked them too. George Budai loved them, but he wasn't a voter, but he loved them. But I have a sneaky feeling that it's because I don't think she was with Bruce Nauman yet, but there was she wasn't. No, okay, well then it wouldn't have been because she was the girlfriend of Bruce Nauman. That would have been in Documenta a very good reason to have had her in Documenta, but in the case of the Paris Biennale, it wasn't. I think that it's shocking there weren't more women. When we look back on that now, we think, how could those people have been sitting in that room acting that way? But you have to remember the next Biennale was, in fact, as we all knew it would be, Magicians of the Earth. And that was a controversial but very problematic and interesting show. And the things they went through to do that were also things that are continue to be discussed to this day in rooms about show organizing, countries organizing shows, colonialist impulses and how that works. In fact, they had much deeper problems than we did.
And regarding a few other artists that I'd like to slowly also go this idea of site-specific works. I don't know about time. Should we do like a 5-minute interruptions? No, should we keep on going?
A few people, they can get through this.
Okay.
We got through it.
Okay, so we just keep on going.
We got through it. You can get through it.
Okay. Okay, well, regarding a few artists who work with like this idea of working with the Grande Halle de la Villette and with the architecture and with the building. This is just the floor plan, but I maybe wanted to look at a few artists before discussing this idea of site-specific works. Keith Haring was maybe one of the artists who, talking with few artists who participated and also looking at the press, it seems like Keith Haring was very important and got a great reception for what he did in the central alley of the Grande Halle de la Villette. Maybe just a few images, maybe before we talk about your collaboration with Keith Haring, just look at him working in the space with another excerpt of the movie. So Keith Haring used this central alley, and how did you work with him, and how did you manage to have him have this space?
Well, when one says I proposed him, until the end, our proposals had to be jointly incorporated into the idea of the show. We were still paying at least lip service to that theory of intellectual communication between the curators. But I proposed Keith because it was obvious he should be here. Keith was already a celebrity before he came to Paris in '85. He was a nightclub artist. He was one of the first of what later became a huge celebrity situation for artists where they could literally be like pop stars. This is very different than it was more like the pop artist, but it was very different than the whole Donald Judd, Richard Serra operation, or the Richard Nonas situation where they were famous, but they weren't celebrity artists. Like Keith was young and adorable and attractive. He was gay beyond belief. There were hundreds, well, I would say that's an exaggeration. There were at least 20 or 30 very young French boys, most from the street, but from all over, that were at La Villette the whole time he was there. And they were assisting in the operation. He would never have been alone like he was painting there, except late at night. There were always people helping him, and it was always fun to work around Keith. I mean, he was used to working in the street and mostly in very big nightclubs where there was a lot going on. There was also a lot of drugs that were involved, because you have to understand these people were painting straight for 20 hours at a time. So you can really only do that with cocaine. You can't do it with heroin or pot. George Bourdieu asked me, he said, "Do you think there are any drugs?" I said, "George, of course there are, but don't you worry, it's not heroin." He said, "Oh, good. I'm so glad. We wouldn't want to have heroin here." Right, you can't really work under heroin, in big show situations you have to have speed or something. And Keith was a very generous and enterprising. He'd already started stores all over with selling t-shirts. And he gave money out all the time. He gave money to all the young people who were helping him. He paid them all the time. And he asked me, and he asked George Bourdieu, when the piece was taken down, when the show was over, he wanted it destroyed. And as his curator, I had to make sure that it was. But he told both of us that the only people that he would make an exception for were the kids that could have a sliver or a chunk of the wall, because they didn't know enough to think that they could sell it at an auction house. They just have it to take home. The last thing that's worth commenting about Keith is that it was during the Paris Biennale plans of 2 years, and then up to the opening, that we all found out about AIDS. Before that, a lot of people knew about AIDS, but the whole world that was in the art world didn't know about AIDS. And Keith already had AIDS by then, although he didn't really find out about it until after that. But death was already stalking our fabulous world of fabulosity. And it was soon going to bring about, in Paris, but all over, a very different kind of feeling about big shows and what could happen with big shows. And the sense of joy that a lot of the young gay artists brought to the operations were going to disappear.
And other than Keith Haring, I'll go to this. A few artists, and actually looking through the archives at the Bibliothèque Kandinsky, a lot of artists applied or gave proposals to work directly with the building. For example, Jenny Holzer also, who wanted to exhibit outside the building with this big electronic signs, and also Mario Merz. And there's several documents in the archives of artists applying to work with the building itself. Maybe we can just look at Lawrence Weiner and one excerpt, and then the excerpt of Jenny Holzer, and then comment on this, both of these works, and then.
I think that we can have a very rewarding discussion a little bit with Richard about site-specific works. Right. But just to comment on the on Jenny, I was of two minds about putting Jenny in this show. I desperately wanted powerful women artists, and she was certainly one, but her determination was, of course, to be outside the complete building, and the budget was fairly large, so I was worried that would eat up too much of the budget. So I dragged my feet on that. And then, fortunately, she had a powerful, rich gallerist who said that she would pay for the expenses of making those pieces, which turned out to be, really important for Jenny to be in that show. I had an assistant who was named John Abbott, who was very eccentric. He used to work at the Sonnabend Gallery for years and years in Paris, and then his French was perfect, but he would often get drunk and get into very big fights on the street over a variety of fairly stupid reasons. And he and Jenny got into a big fight, and he tried to kill her. So that was an aspect which didn't give Jenny and I a good basis for going forward as friends. So I had to convince her to not prosecute him. He didn't want to kill her, he just wanted her to be quiet. So he put a pillow over her head for a little while, but he wasn't very strong. Also, he had just come out of the shower and he was naked. So she thought he was trying to rape her, but unfortunately, it wasn't going to happen because John was very gay, and he wasn't going to rape Jenny Holzer. He hated her robe. He hated everything about her. He just wanted her to shut up, right? Because he'd been trying to deal with the budgets for those stupid pieces anyway. So this was a difficulty thing, and George Bucay kept saying, "Oh, but why would he want to rape her?" I said, George, just stop this. So John was fired, and he went home in disgrace, and fortunately Jenny's piece persevered because it was indeed very good. But that was using the city, much like Gordon wanted to use the city, and use the Biennale as a vehicle for sort of promotion of a piece. It really had very little to do with the La Villette, which was a very exciting proposition, unlike other artists who did propose things that were related to the former market, a changing thing, a giant space, 30-foot ceilings, all these other things. And I think that that's tricky. Some artists see proposing site-specific work for big shows as a way of getting in the show, because curators get completely seduced by these things. You say, oh, John Baldessari, he's promised to put his photograph up on top of this sort of crucifix. It will be like church. We'll have John Baldessari. And you can't get it out of your mind. You keep voting, yes, John, yes, John. But I named a very good artist and a good friend, other than naming a bad artist and a bad friend. But I think that the issue of site specificity is one which is much, much overused, and very interesting what it's come down to now, which is now you have curators refusing to take work the last, say, 10 to 15 years out of studios because they want something made specially for them. It's like going to a couture designer. You know, I want something made for me. So I actually don't have time to make something for the Cadillac Biennale in, Oslo. Oh, but it has to be just for us, just for us. Richard Nonas is an artist who's very wise about these things, and he makes a lot of sculpture, and a lot of it is site-specific, and he's doing it to this day, a fascinating project right now in the south of France that he's worked on for a couple of years, and I think we should really turn to him and ask him to speak to us about the issue of site-specific work. Is that possible? Is that
yes,
okay?
yes, totally, and then we can maybe look at a few images of other, but yes, please, and you've been writing about site-specific with, no, this is perfect.
Like so many other things, the problems start with the words, with the names. I think it's a terrible term. I think that all it means is that it's a big room, I'll make a big piece. It's it's a blue wall, so what color goes with that blue wall? It's about decorating. That the word suggests. It's about window making store windows, department store windows. It's not about the work. It's about making a good place for the work. Is what that word, that phrase means to me. But I do believe very strongly that some of the best art of any generation in any culture that I know are made objects that, in fact, use other aspects of the world as part of themselves, as part of the sculpture itself. So, as Alanna suggested, the last 2 days I've been working with Nadine, who's sitting there, on a
French curator, I suspect.
on a very large piece in the mountains near Ding. And the point is, I'm not interested in putting an object in the mountains. I'm interested in changing that place. I'm interested in making something that uses that whole area, not just that part of the mountain, but that whole place in relation to the larger mountains around it, and changing it with that work, and making all of that a single thing. It's like what I said about the group show. The group shows that are the best. It's only one piece. It's the show. You look at details, fine. You know that door handle is really nice, but it's not the thing. The room is the thing. And so that word is bad, but so is the word installation, which is even much. I haven't heard anybody say site-specific in America in 10 years, actually. It's not a term that I've heard used recently. But the term that is used are installations. And it's the same kind of word. It's about a stage set. Really, literally.
Installation is about stage sets.
Yeah. It's about how can I, I'm doing such and such a play, what should the stage look like to carry the feeling of that? Yeah, but that's not art. That's not sculpture. That's not what interests me, at least, in sculpture. What interests me is, in those terms, is when the boundaries of the work don't end at the object.
And also that's why you were saying you wrote that the terms site-specific or installation are deceiving. They're changing the subject.
Yeah, yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, in a way, I think that much of what we're talking about here is about changing the subject. That is, the curators are arguing with themselves, with each other, not in terms of. Excuse me, I'm sorry, of the art, but of how much power, the power balances, and I want my artist. It's not about the work, it's about something else. It's changing the subject. The subject starts out being, how can we make a powerful statement of whatever kind of statement we've all decided we want to make. But then it becomes about all these other things. And the same thing is true when you're talking about a single work. Is the work, in fact, a term that a lot of curators in America, but also artists in America, talk in terms of sculpture, talk about plop sculpture. That is an object that you take out of the studio and you put it in the gallery. You're plopping it down on the floor there. Yeah, it looks good there.
That's a verb,
Yeah.
P-L-O-P, and when it's past tense, it's plopped. So a sculpture is bad if it's plopped on a plaza.
It's like a base, a plinth, a painted white box that you put the sculpture on top of. What does that mean? It means that it's privileged space. It means it's not in the world. It means that it doesn't matter that there's a water cooler next to it. You don't look at anything except what's on top of that white thing. I once, years ago, when I was quite young, found myself in a rodeo in a small town in the western United States. And the star of the rodeo was a Western movie star who was well past his prime and also was totally drunk. And he was riding around on his white horse, going around the ring, and taking his hat off. And suddenly he fell off the horse. But he had the microphone in his hand. He fell off the horse, totally drunk. But he had the presence of mind to say, "Don't look at me, folks. Look at the horse." That's what
This is great.
That's what that kind of sculpture is for me.
Actually, that's just changed my entire opinion now about plopped sculpture. By the way, I'm curious, has fashion changed slightly, Richard? The beautiful and successful Anish Kapoor sculpture in Chicago, the silver jelly bean, I mean, it's just beautiful. It's really wonderful. It's well placed. It's all that. But it is plopped.
Well, no, it isn't. Actually, it isn't. No, it's in a park, and it's very close to a big building by Frank Gehry.
Right.
I just did something very close to it at the Chicago Art Institute.
Right.
In fact, it's beautifully placed, and it was and he made it surely because he knew the kind. It's totally reflective, and he knew the kind of movement in that space, and he made it specifically for those reflections.
That's
So
interesting.
the piece is not, people talk about it as the jelly bean, but in fact, what he did was he made a new plaza.
It's just beautiful.
Yeah.
By the way, I think that another thing you should organize, let's say next year, would be a whole series of sort of investigations in a perverse sense, what sculpture has been really effective other places and had very disastrous results in Paris or France, just France.
Or the other way around.
Or the other way around. Anyway, excuse me for that intervention. But the whole Versailles romance with Anish is a very sad story. You know, the desecration of the Anish piece in Versailles and why it didn't work and why we should think about that. But Richard, back to you. The reason I got interested in the piece you were working on, this village in the south, was that I thought it was a ghost city in the mountains that had been abandoned and the only thing left was the church, and that this curator, this French curator, was bringing in some art to sort of represent, not in a shabby celebrity way, not in a tourist attraction way, no, in a beautiful way, to put work back that even though there were no people, there was going to be a soul in the village again. And how does that work out with, could it be that I can't use site specific, can it be that this work is just too romantic?
No, but that's not what it was, in fact. It was an abandoned village with a 12th century church that was much too big for the size. The village had never been more than 300 people. But it turned out that in the 12th century, it was that place high in the mountains, no 2-hour walk to get there from the nearest road, was in fact the international boundary between France and Savoy. So that large church was there as much as a boundary mark and a fortification as for a church. Anyway, complicated history. And since at least the 12th century, the last man left in 1939 carrying the tin roof of his house on his back and walked to the nearest town on the road, built a house, and died only a few years ago. So this village, this abandoned village in the Alps, southern in Provence, represented for a very large area of people living in these mountains, represented what it meant to live in the mountains, represented how difficult it was, how dangerous it was, what a complicated history was there. It was an enormously important place, this abandoned village, in the lives of a fairly large geographic area, many small villages and a lot of people. And it's also an area where there's a lot of people who walk through the mountains. So many people knew about this abandoned village. And the church. And the church, the reason this whole project happened was the church was falling apart much more than it had been for the last years. And the local people were trying to save the church. Now this is very interesting about France. They couldn't get money from the government to preserve the church. But somebody in the area was smart enough to realize that maybe they could accomplish that by instituting an art project. They could get the money for that and save the church.
Okay.
And the local people, but didn't know what to do, came to Nadine, who's sitting there, and Nadine, to her credit, realized that she couldn't do what it wouldn't work to do what you said, to just put down objects there. There had to be something there that wasn't an object, something that we didn't have a name for, nobody had a name for, but a way to mark that village and to in a certain sense, make that history and that emotional power of that place in the minds of a lot of people more visible. And she asked me to do it and to do something, and I said, yeah, but I don't know what to do. And I took several years, or at least, a fairly long time, going there very often and talking to as many people as I could. I was an anthropologist. So for that time, I was really trying to figure out what this place meant. And we went through all the archives we could find. We did as much research as we could. And we began to have a sense of what this place meant to the people for whom it was important.
I think this is an important point to me. Much of the reason that I intensely do not believe in public art is because the predominant feeling in the selection of public artists is that they must somehow review the feelings of the people and do something that they would like. And I think that's the bad way to make art. But you're saying you were trying to find out what the place actually meant. You weren't trying to make the non-residents happy. You were trying to...
Or the residents
happy. Or the residents happy, right.
But I'm trying to find a way to in a certain sense, physicalize that sense of historical presence and power. What it meant to live in a hard place like that, in a harsh climate, difficult, economically impossible situation, over 1,000 years.
Richard, you've not asked for a name change, but you've started saying that you're less comfortable with the name, with being called a sculptor. Is that?
Well, yeah, I mean, I make objects in order to make places. I'm interested in making powerful places. That is, changing a place and giving it, underlining and punctuating the underlying presence that's already there. And the objects that I make are only tools to do that. So I'm not very interested in the objects themselves. I'm interested in what they can do.
Is it possible that it might be, I don't mean easier physically, that it might be easier to do this in landscape in the country than in the urban landscape?
No, or indoors or outdoors. It doesn't matter. Small scale, big scale. No,
Okay.
It's possible to do the same thing, but you do it differently. And what works in one place doesn't work in another. I can't move if I move one of the objects that I make, it becomes a different object.
Richard's done a lot of work in France, and he did in the middle of Paris, that whole, in the Tuileries, right? You had that long...
Well, twice. I mean, once was just with paired boulders for the art fair, for FIAC.
Yeah.
You know, these complicated things that last for 4 days.
Okay,
But,
okay.
yeah, but sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. But the point that I was trying in both cases, I did it also with the wood thing that you have pictures of, which didn't work so well as I wanted it to, as a matter of fact. But the stones did.
And you exhibit it outside, and this is also something that I found quite striking. Like during the 13e Biennale de Paris in 1985, lots of artists who came before the show, who came to Paris to see the Grande Halle de la Villette, it seems like that they didn't want to then exhibit inside the building, but outside the building.
No,
And this is also...
I wanted to work outside.
And you wanted it to work
Because I
outside, but
hate-
this is something that was that is in common with many artists from 1985. Apparently, that they gave proposals to work with the architecture, but outside the architecture. Maybe also because the architecture was changed a lot by Jean Nouvel, but this is another story.
But for good reason, because the problem with working with the architecture in a group show is that there's no architecture. I mean, that is the architecture has been so much changed by what's already there that you're not working. In fact, even if you're working with the columns you're not working with the architecture itself. You're working with the group show. And if you can do that and make it work, fine. But that's much more difficult, especially since you don't know what it's going to be yet when you see the empty room. So, you know, this was for FIAC.
People were afraid
art
of...
fairs. I hate art fairs. I mean, in a certain sense, because it's really they're you know, small selling areas is really all they are. It's a good way to see a lot of stuff, but nothing looks good. I think if you talk to a lot of artists, they'll say, you know, yeah, the work doesn't look good there. I know the work is better than that. But anyway, so the most interesting thing was it's not a question of outdoors or indoors, but the space between the Petit Palais and the Grand Palais is a very charged situation. And I wanted to see what I could do. The other thing is it's full of crowds during FIAC, and I wanted to make something people would sit on. Not because I wanted to make furniture, but I wanted that interaction.
Just like the piece by Jean Hastings also, which was in between in 1975, in between the Palais de Tokyo and Musée d'Art Moderne de la Ville de Paris, and it chose that place in between the two sites as well. oops. And this is something about the 1985 Biennale that is also a little bit puzzling, how you had works that were meant to be site-specific. I'm sorry, I'm using the term again. And also a lot of works that were paintings and very different, and that gave this whole show a very eclectic feeling.
Did you say eclectic?
Yes.
Okay,
And
that's usually a code word for bad looking.
well, actually, I was just about to say that this term was used by Achille, and it's in the film, and he said like this feeling of eclecticism.
He thought it was a good word.
Probably. This
Achille is
is
very
not what I
generous.
meant, but I obviously didn't see the show.
Achille is very generous
so-
with different styles.
And, well, I don't know if we have, maybe we'll go back to, I wanted to maybe watch this a couple excerpts of Casper Conning talking about the role of Paris and Paris in comparison with other European places, that we could also discuss that.
Well, I mean, it's very interesting to me to have the opportunity to work in a lot of different places. Situation is different. Every aspect of the situation is different in each country, or in each city, actually, very often. That is, you know, there's never, in the way I think about art, there's never a blank slate. You always start with in a complex situation. And the situations are always, in fact, even more complex than you are willing to acknowledge they are. And that influences anything you make. So anything you make exists in relation to that, historically, physically, even the sound, you know, of that place, inside or outside. A room with bad acoustics, in an art fair with bad acoustics, everything, that's one of the reasons that nothing feels right. I mean, there's just too much going on. So, I mean, it's always, the situation you start with is always different. Mm-hmm. And it seems, and the only real meaning that those things like site-specific mean to me is that you, in fact, deal with that as part of the work, or acknowledge that that changes the work at the very least. Yeah.
Hopefully, you can control the way the work looks by, look, in the very early 70s, the way that Carl Andre and various artists of that ilk, he's only a couple of years younger than the group that, older than a group that came after him, but by saying that it was site-specific, that meant they could control where it went on the wall and what went around it. And there were certain exhibitions that so ignored the nature and the grandness of that art. As usual, this is often done by architects who have only contempt, barely concealed contempt for contemporary art. And I remember an installation called 200 Years of American Sculpture, which had been done by, the installation was done by the Venturis, who are, you know, of course, very accomplished and incredibly informed, not naive at all, architects. But in the installation, they had one of the Solowit grid pieces, sculptural grid pieces that was freestanding. Then they had a big Robert Morris piece, one of the felt pieces that had loops that was installed too close to it on the wall. Then they took one of the loops from the Robert Morris felt piece, pulled it out from the wall, and draped it over the Solowit grid. Now, I know that if they're curators or, you know, people in the room or artists, you're just shuddering. You're thinking, no, it couldn't happen. Things like that happen, and I've seen them happen. It used to be that artists like Richard would trust people like me, would ask us to go to shows prior to the installation and call them if something like that was going on, so they could get a chance to either pull the work out or do something. In the case of Carl Andre, who was about 4 feet away from that particular situation, he he couldn't bear where his piece was placed, and our mutual friend Bob Grosvenor, who'd had this beautiful pipe that was covered with this sort of strange fuzzy car prep painting material that was so delicate and fragile, the spray itself would really go into the air. We had to redo it about every 2 weeks at the clock tower. And we treated it like it was a holy object, which it was. It was a pipe on the floor, but it was tapered. It was very, very, very beautiful, very fragile. And the Whitney came to borrow it, and I mean, Bob was very nervous about it, and he said, please be there, and they did. They wouldn't listen to me at all. And we knew that it would have to be recovered once that it was in the Whitney, because they didn't understand that their fingerprints were on the substance, you know. So they took it away, and they put it up at the Whitney, and when they got it situated theoretically, Bob was told that he couldn't come because they didn't want him to change the location. But finally, I talked them into letting him come and give it kind of a final spray, you know, like before you go up for the big date, you take that spray can, and, you know, you just put it around your head. So he went up and did that, but he was already traumatized when he saw where it was placed, so he just went home and cried. One of the problems in artists, big men artists like Bob Grosvenor, they tend to cry a lot. You know, it's horrible. It's horrible to see these big men cry. They go like this. You know, your heart breaks for them because, you know, you're used to crying as a girl. It's horrible. But, you know, they go, they're trying to control themselves. But what happened when I went up to look at the final Grosvenor situation is I saw footprints on the pipe. It meant that people had literally thought that it would be fun, this is installers, to walk on the pipe to see if they could do it without, you know, sliding off. I don't know. And, you know, I demanded photographs of the footprints so they could be investigated to find out whose tennis shoe. These are tennis shoes, right? I mean, these are nightmares. I'm just choosing one show to talk about because it was done by a very good museum and a very great architectural firm that didn't exercise any control, because you see, this stuff is funny. It's basically funny art. Around this same time, NBC contacted me at the clock tower, and they said, we're doing a series of shows in prime time, very, very short, but right before the evening news, in prime time, and it's called You Call This Art. And we're going around and we're looking at important art pieces which are very different from those things that our audience. And if you want to help convince people what it is, you'll help us, and you'll be an interpreter, like a translator. They kept saying, like a translator. So I said, sure. And they came down, and I talked. You know, I wasn't on the screen or anything. I was talking to the guy who was going to talk about it. And they said, you have to leave because now I'm going to do this. I'm the newscaster. You know, I don't have anybody in with me while I do this. So then we all got together in my house to watch television for what was going to be primetime introduction of this whole gang's work to the world, NBC. And the title of the show was a man's bass voice coming in and saying, you call this art? Instead of, you call this art, it was, you call this art? And they come in and they say, these people call this art. And they laugh, you know, and then they do shots of it, and they say, now, this may not seem, you know, like art to you and me, but, you know, some people do call this art. Let's find out why. And they say, and then they talk to some intensely passionate person like me and say, oh, yes, it's art because you can see, you know, and we just all look like assholes because we call that art. But this is part of the whole art discussion we're even having here, is over the course of the years, in 40 or 50 years, between, you know, 85 and now, between 70s and now, we're actually still calling most of the stuff that we called art in the late 60s, we're still calling art. And the positive thing we have to think about is that now a lot of other people are calling this art too. And it's selling for a lot of money. I mean, we never dreamt, Richard and I, that there would be zillionaires around the world buying things for millions and millions of dollars. I mean, this is just inconceivable that an artist could have that kind of money coming in. it's also inconceivable to museums, because we see galleries, you know, having fourth and fifth houses and islands, and Gagosian has his own private airplane. I mean, ask yourself, his own private airplane. I mean, that's like a head of state, and it's with, he has, you know, what is it, 600 employees, 12 galleries around the world. Obviously, a lot of people call that art, and they're willing to buy it. So, you know, I think that that's the good news. It's a lot going to be good news for a lot of people in this room, because you're not going to ever be a part of that, either an ownership or recipient of money, or you, Nadine, you're not, you know, you may get a couple, you may maybe get like $20,000 more to help that village, you know, brush up the sign or something somewhere. But it doesn't matter. The big money will always be somewhere else. It's never going to be around us. It's the idea that we called it art, and it is art. And our society has changed because it's art. And I think that's something to celebrate in your wonderful symposium. I give speeches on Sunday, too, by the way.
Now, listen, I think that what's really interesting here is that from the 70s in that situation to the 80s for this show in that situation, and now the process of making and showing art is in fact very, very complicated. Complicated not just because of how difficult it is to understand the art or not, but because everybody involved is in themselves complicated. That is, whether you're a curator, a museum director, or an artist, you've got many, many different things that you have to deal with at the same time, which means that you're not dealing only with what's best for that piece of art. You can't. It never happens. Artists as well. I mean, it's always more complicated than we want it to be. But the interesting thing is that in each time period, in the 70s, the problems were in one place. In the 80s, it was in another place. And also from city to city or country to country. So for me, it's very difficult, very different to work in France than to work in Italy. For many, many reasons, including the fact that Italian curators are not the same as French curators. Nor are the spaces, nor are the art handlers. Actually, the only thing that's international in the art world are the art handlers.
Art handlers.
That's really interesting. If you go to an art fair in South America, or in Russia, or in Torino, or in Paris, a big show, you walk in, it's the same art handlers. They travel all over the world to every show.
And maybe before we open the discussion, just watch briefly what also Casper Conning was saying about this. He has not very nice words, but just like some articles that were publishing at the same time about the role of Paris, and maybe the fact that this Biennale was not the success expected in terms of the place for Paris for the years after the Biennale. I like this part when he's mentioning the fact that you shouldn't over-organize.
I think that was a very, very special thing to say, and I really liked sitting here and listening to Casper and seeing how young he was and we were, and how much he believed. I think that when I started out, I said that I thought that Casper and I shared a certain, I don't want to call it naivete, but utopian dream about this particular show, and that Achille was much wiser in so many ways to understand what was going on. Something which I may not want to go into the movie or whatever comes out of this is that one of the things that made the great young Paris Biennale great was that it was, I've told you this before, Lisa, and I think I told you when you interviewed me. It was a strange show because it had this 36 rule, but it also was ruled by chaos. Georges Boudai who interests me more and more as I get older now and think of myself as the age of George Bataille. George Bataille was probably an extreme alcoholic. I mean, I knew he was an alcoholic at the time, but I didn't realize the extent to which that had influenced the way the Biennale was structured. And he was a much admired man. He was very smart, and he was extremely interesting, but his life was led in a certain amount of chaos, and because had been a big resistance hero, as you know, a lot of people always say they are, but not very many people, I think, really were. I'm not suggesting he wasn't. He was probably a great resistance leader. I mean, he certainly had the gift of gab. I mean, he could have talked anybody into anything. But George didn't have a handle on the recommenders that were worldwide. They had a system where you'd sort of send in names of people. I was a recommender for years, and a recommender could easily subvert the entire process of the French Biennale by just becoming different recommenders. And you get 3 or 4 people together, you could recommend half the show just out of New York, out of my apartment. You know, so not that I did that, though I certainly would have if I thought of it. But you know, and also the artists could break into this show, which is another important thing. I recognize this and put it into the structure of PS1, which a couple of things that I borrowed from understanding this show, my first big Biennale show. You got to let artists, you got to be flexible enough that artists can somehow worm their way in because they have to, because they're so passionate and they have to get into this show. Because that's how all the artists get into these shows, essentially, eventually. Now they don't, they get into their dealers or their collectors or whatever. But the French Biennale was something you could wiggle into. That's how Gordon got in, Gordon Mata. I remember him saying to me, oh, I just went over and sat around for a while. You know, I could speak French because I was raised by Mata, you know. So Gordon could get in that way, and Richard couldn't because he was too old. He was a year too old. A lot of people I know wiggled into the Biennale, and that was kind of refreshing because when you got over here, you never knew what you were going to see. And a lot of it was terrible, but a lot of it was really interesting, and it was something you can't orchestrate very well, and a lot of it had to do with the fact that Bataille was just very badly organized. His correspondence, he had lots and lots and lots of correspondence and huge amounts of files. But because he had so many mistresses and so many secretaries, you know, the files are always floating around because he'd take them with him all the time. He'd say, I'm leaving now. I'm going to have to leave you. I have a meeting with an artist, and then I have to have a meeting with a friend. And he'd take all these files, he'd leave and go off. And we would see him again for the entire day. You know, he'd come back around 6 and drunk, right? And I said, where are the files, George? You took all of our plans for it. He said, I'm sorry. Bring them back tomorrow first thing. You know. Anyway, you have to understand, he was subverting his own curators, but not because he hated us, but because his life was in some disarray. And I think back about that a lot. I think about Pontus Hultin and how he ran Centre Pompidou in the early years, and how subversion becomes kind of good in a certain way, and how it breaks the rules and it lets art get in. A trick I learned from this Biennale is that in every big show, unified show I did, I leave one room empty. And it's not like some pokey room in the back. No. It's got to be a quasi-important room. Because if it's a quasi-important room, you're going to do something about it. And leave it empty until minimum 2 weeks before the show opens. The international show opens. And I'll put an artist or artists in that room before the show opens. It's something that's happened. A shipment has arrived. A new artist has come. You see something that you love more than anything else. You say to yourself, oh, if I only had that in my show. Well, you can have it in your show. You just leave a room empty. And if you don't see anything good enough to go in that room, fine. Close the door. In a place like PS1, you have 100 rooms. That's fine. Now, I know when you have 4 rooms in a gallery and you're trying to do the final show that's going to be your thesis called Development of Art and Semiotics in Landscape. It's hard to just throw something into that room in the last minute. But in most shows you can. You know, even Development of Art and Semiotics in Landscape, you can, at last minute, you're walking down, you looked over the bridge, you see a boat, and you know. Semiotics, landscape. Anyway,
That's a great idea. I mean, I never heard you say that, actually. Yeah.
I learned that from
I just
that.
want to say one thing. You mentioned Pontus, whole team. Pontus was originally the director of the
Moderna Museet.
in Stockholm. Then he was the founding director here of Pompidou Center. And then he was the founding director of the museum in Los Angeles. The shows were different in each place. And he was the same person. He was very passionate about it. But the place influenced the shows he made. And in a very interesting way. Somebody should do a study of that, actually, of those shows.
Here's a tip Pontus gave me. I give it to all the people I interview. Sophie will hear this tomorrow when she comes. Pontus he said to me, because I came over to work on the Centre Pompidou installation. By work, I mean hang around. And say, what about that? Anyway, we're walking through at Centre Pompidou late at night. All the installers are working and everything's crazy. And he said, Alanna, why is it that you have this determination to start this kind of new museum object in New York and so on? He said, don't you want to be a museum director? And I said, no, I don't want to be a museum director. That's the last thing I want to be. It'd be horrible, like being the director of a university or something. He said, no, being museum director is great. It's a great thing. It's a great thing to do. It's great. I said, why is it great, Pontus? And he said, many reasons, but the first one that comes to mind is if you're the director of a museum, you can go there in the middle of the night and you can make love in front of your favorite paintings.
I guess that's
There's no more convincing argument that can be made.
Nope.
I've always pictured Pontus at Centre Pompidou. He was even then quite round. He was a big man. He was quite chubby, and I could just see him. I was just thinking, which painting is he in front of now? It's such a wonderful idea. Next time you go to Centre Pompidou, walk by and just think, I wonder if Pontus is in front of that painting. It'll change your entire feeling. And if you knew this about Musée d'Orsay, you'd feel much differently about Musée d'Orsay. Or even the Louvre. Yeah. Rolling around on the floor.
Maybe on this note, we can open the discussion. Sylvie. Thank you. Il y a un micro qui doit circuler, ou peut-être qu'on peut faire circuler.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions?
The captive French curator.
Thank you very much to you too. I have a question for you both. You both worked and exhibited in Paris in the 1970s and 1980s when Paris was really transformed in terms of its urban space, and especially in the neighborhoods that you worked in, like the Centre Pompidou and the neighborhood of La Villette too. And so I was just wondering whether this urban transformation of Paris was something that struck you at the time, and if it inspired you in some way, or if it changed your idea of what especially the Parisian culture and cultural ambitions were about in these decades.
Well, okay. First of all, both of us come from New York, so that urban transformation is the starting point of everything. I mean, there's no way to do anything in New York without having to deal with how it's changed since the last time you were there. So, in a way, feeling that I lived in Paris in 68 and 67, 68. And, but coming back years later, that change was a very big change. But nonetheless, that kind of change was my baseline in a certain way for dealing with cities. And also even rural areas. And yeah, it always influences what I did and what I wanted to do and the way I saw the world. But the interesting thing for me is, not only in Paris, but working in any European cities, I know that I don't know enough. I know that I can see what I can see, but if I lived here, and if it was my city, I would feel very differently about it. I would see different things. So what to this day, what is really important to me when I'm working outside of even outside of New York, because other parts of America are quite different from New York, is what I'm seeing, does what I'm seeing make sense for the people who actually live here? Not in terms of what's art and what isn't art, but of that baseline, of the starting point. Is this place in the city what I think it is? And I love that. And I love the fact that I have to try to figure that out. I have to try to figure it out in the same way I had to try to figure out what was going on in the village of 50 people in northern Mexico in the desert that I lived in for 2 years. After the first year, I thought I understood what was going on. By the second year, I realized I didn't know anything that was going on. But that was wonderful in a way. It was wonderful to be there and feel that tension, but not be able to put my finger on it. And that's what happens when I work in France, or in Italy, or in Sweden, and my job is to try to figure out what other people there are seeing and feeling, but also to push against it my different view. And that tension, that kind of doubleness, that kind of tension, I think is the motor of all interesting art and all powerful art. But not only about that urban, or the larger place, but in every detail. That's what. I just want to say something a little. My general feeling is any art that you can describe in words is not strong art. That the job of visual art is to say things that you cannot say in language.
That's really an important thing to say. Could you just say it again? Really, it's hard for me to catch it again.
No, what I mean to say is that I do a lot of writing. Words I use them a lot. I play with them, in the objects that I make, there are things I can express things that I cannot express in words. In fact, that cannot be expressed in words because the words change them. The words lock something in. There's less ambiguity in words than there is in what can be communicated through objects and colors and forms. And that ambiguity is absolutely necessary to me in everything. In people, the people who I want to be with, spend time with, but also certainly in any art that interests me. Ambiguity and doubleness and the tension between a yes and a yes but, or a maybe, is really that's where the meat is.
Okay, I'm just going to talk about a course myself. I hated France because I kept failing the French language courses that I needed to graduate from college. And I have the equivalent of a PhD in hours of French. I started taking French when I was about 9 years old as an after-school class, and then kept on and couldn't graduate from university. I was still, at that point, in second year French. So I had to take it in summer school. As I hated it more and more, I became less able to speak anything. And obviously a psychiatric case. So what happened was some concerned professors just got together, and I took some summer school classes. I was almost one person in the class, and they got me through. And I got a terrible grade, and it brought my entire average down. And so I vowed that I would never, ever put my foot in France. That was a big vow. I made it, and I kept it. I moved to London in '66, and I lived there until 71. And during all that time, for the first 2 years, I traveled all over Europe, especially to see shows that were going on in Germany then, because there were a lot of them were showing interesting American artists at the very end of the '60s. There was also a lot of interesting political activity going on, as you know, everywhere from Joseph Beuys, who was organizing the students in Dusseldorf, to the Baader-Meinhof gang, which, you know, were art-related. But I wouldn't go to France. And I wanted to go to Morocco a lot because I was interested in John Cage, who told me to go, and I was interested in Paul Bowles, and Jane Bowles was an idol of mine. So I would take a ferry to Portugal, a car ferry, and then drive all the way down to Spain, and then go through Algeciras and everything. And we went, the most painful thing was when to go with the Rolling Stones to Marrakesh was always like a very, you know, wonderful thing. I still love saying, I was last in Marrakesh with the Stones. The truth is, you know, when the Stones would go to Marrakesh, like 100 people would go, 120 people. You'd have to be a girlfriend, right? He was a member of a large group of people. But when the Stones went, they went through Paris, you see, because they all wanted to stop in Paris. They all had houses in the south of France. Couldn't go. Couldn't go, but that's when I knew there was something deeply wrong with my relationship. I was not a mature person. I couldn't even go with the Rolling Stones through Paris, and I said, got to change this. It's just an old grudge. I have to accept the fact that I can't speak French. And I have to accept the fact, and just say it, I'll never speak French. And I won't, and I'll never, I can say hors d'oeuvre, I can say bonjour, I cannot say the other name of Centre Pompidou. I have practiced that my whole life, since 1976. I can't say Beaubourg, because I can't make those sounds. Beaubourg, I can't do it. I've recorded it. I've practiced it with Pontus. I can't say it. All right. So once I admitted that I couldn't speak French and I would never speak French, there was a huge weight off my shoulders, and my relationship with France changed. I started going through France. I was very vulnerable. I was trying to keep it easy, and I had some friends, and I got better friends and better friends, and eventually I did a lot of work in France. I think one reason I was able to work in France so much, especially in the 80s and 90s, is because I didn't speak French. The French were very difficult for us to work with because they would make fun of you, but in nasty ways, in French. If you understood French, you'd be wounded, right? But since I didn't understand French, you know, I felt pretty good about what they were saying. And I had 3 translators quit because they would be so upset over the way things that were said to me in meetings. You know, they just couldn't take it after a while. They just couldn't take it. They'd say, you know, you really should try to get a little more dignity. These people do not respect you from the thing, you know, they just don't respect you. And I say, yeah.
But you're still working in France quite a lot.
No, I'm not. I wish I were working more. I was really happy to be invited. I was here 3 times, of course, in the spring, right. So I guess I am working in France all the time. The other thing that happened was I started having apartments in France. My husband loves France, and we had an apartment on the Rue de Bac during the entire Biennale time and kept it for 10 or 12 years. And then later on, had an apartment in, of all things, I know, I'm ashamed to say it, I couldn't tell anybody for a long time. Here it is.
16s?
Yeah. I'd never been there, didn't want to know anybody who was there, but we had this rent-controlled apartment that we rented for years, 10, 15 years. And by the way, the light was great, and it came in, and I realized what a grand, old-fashioned space French had and how they looked at spaces. It changed every time, you know, I changed it when I figured out why the French were in these spaces, what they were looking at. Then about 10 years ago, I realized that I just loved being in France. And here's why. First of all, it's like being deaf. Since I don't understand French, I relax everywhere I go, and I don't worry about anything. I just can't do it because I can't worry about it. And I write everything out, like 16th. Everything I do, I write. I go out with signs, like a school child, or like a deaf person that says, take her so-and-so, and I'm not ashamed of it. You see, I just know that's my problem. And people are very nice when they think. We were having lunch with someone who called, his expression was limited. Remember? He said that person is limited. So people are very kind when you're limited. You know, And French people can be very kind. They no longer make fun of you as this international curator. They know you're a limited international curator. And so, you know, the second thing that I realized about the 5th time I was here for New Year's Eve, I realized that give it up. France is just beautiful, and it's not ashamed of being beautiful. Everywhere else I've been, in art, in my world, and my artists are ashamed of being beautiful. France is not. It has lights, it has store windows. You know, just think, every young boy dreams of going to Paris and making store windows with lots of lights in them. And then I get to go and look at that window in Bon Marché, and I can cry at the vignettes and the villages and the fantasies and all that. It's just possibly Paris is possibly one of the most beautiful cities in the world. And you gotta go with that, that great beauty, and the feeling that it's all right to be beautiful. It may even be the best thing in the world to be beautiful. They don't have to be deep. They don't have to have great artists. They don't have to have any of that because it's just so beautiful. The food is wonderful. The people are beautiful. The women are beautiful. They know, I mean, French women are born knowing about scarves. I'll never be able to tie a scarf my whole life, but every French woman can tie a scarf. These are things that I know they sound silly, but when you live in a country, and only occasionally, I used to spend like a month a year in France, 2 weeks at a time, you go and you think, I'm so happy to be here, where this is a whole nation is committed to beauty.
Well, apparently that didn't help the Biennale de Paris to last after 1985, but
Well, the
maybe
art
another
world went in a
question.
different direction, you know. I think that there's been a shift in installation that we all should be alert. And Richard doesn't like the title. He's really not going to like this. There are really big shifts in how people are looking at art and why they're looking at art. Sure. And a lot of it has to do with installation. A lot of it has to do with immersive theater. So that huge groups of people who, they call it art, are going to places where installations are created. Here's an example, the Museum of Ice Cream. Have you all heard about that? You know what it is. It's just environments that are created that you can go in and take selfies. They're kind of crazy environments, but they're stylistically not bad. I mean, they're really kind of interesting. Who knows what this comes out of? A lot of people say that it comes out of the Burning Man circumstance for 20 years in the desert, where people who are not artists, believe me, they're not artists. I've been to Burning Man a lot. I like Burning Man. They're not artists. Come and build these gigantic things which are fun and wonderful and beautiful, and they're very moved by them, and they're part of a group that's great and wonderful and this thing. So that's Museum of Ice Cream is a very, very bad example. There's a better and more interesting example, Richard. It's called Meow House. Meow House started in New Mexico with a bunch of kind of failed artists, you know, and they said, oh, well, we're having some fun here. Everybody likes installation. Why don't we use technology in an interesting way where we can have big, like, warehouse full of, like, big mixture of installation. They weren't worried about it being one artist's installation or one idea. A show they used constantly when they told me about this was having gone to a Yo-Yo Kusama show. You all know what Yo-Yo Kusama is and how overwhelming it is and how you stand in line for 10 hours so that you can go in and have your eyeballs burned out by looking at Yo-Yo Kusama, who, by the way, is probably the craziest woman alive today on this earth, and I know her really well. She has a studio in an insane asylum in Tokyo, which is a beautiful studio, and they take care of her, they feed her, and she's just great. She can do anything because she has the vision. So they went to see this Yo-Yo Kusama show, and they figured, what could be better than Yo-Yo Kusama? 100 Yo-Yo Kusamas. So they put people who had different ideas than Yo-Yo Kusama, but you know, like, there's polka dots and there's other things. There's purple mountains. There's, I don't know what, stuff on the floor. So this is like a huge, weird, involved, visual, let's call it banquet of installation. And you walk through it and you lose your balance. You take photographs and you're really in something. You're really in it. It's not just art. it goes right beyond art. And there was something that was done in New York about 5 years ago called Sleep No More. It's become really important in theater. It's a series of townhouses which are interrelated. And it's like what we used to do illegally. But this is legal. And you walk through and you see various vignettes happening throughout the buildings, and people are in costume. And it's like a combination, the story of O, and like some softcore porn stuff, and some costumes going on, and they have bars, and you're drinking at the bar, and then suddenly you realize you're standing next to an actor, but who's acting that they're at a party and you're at the same party. So it's theater which is expanding. This is old hat, I know to you, but which has expanded the idea of what it means to be at theater. You're actually in the theater, and this has to do with installation. And I think that once like the rap stars got into installation, I mean, they're really into installation now. I hope you know the news that Marina Abramovich, who is a girlfriend, who is a friend, who we know is a good artist, is involved with the Kardashians now. Yeah, you know that, okay. The Kardashians are doing performance art. It's just tough to be the person that brings that news to Paris, but I'm the person. And there it is. And, they're not all involved with performance art. Chloe's not, Clovis is not. It's just really Kendall and Kyler. So reality television has changed a lot of how we view film. Unscripted things are interesting, and they are then going into the edited versions of our lives, which are now subsets of art versions, which are subsets. And the whole Brian Geist idea of cut-ups, and the whole Burroughs ideas of merged scripts become a kind of crazy art of the future, and I'm absolutely certain it's going to come with a vengeance to Paris. I'm looking forward to that, because who can better do this? More beautiful installations of all different kinds, all juxtaposed. I think that you don't like this idea, because I think you're a snob. I think you're a minimal art snob. Look at her. She can hardly control herself.
Probably.
Even though I'm an honored guest. You're just a minimal art snob. No minimal art person is going to like this idea. But those of you who are young or old and bored, just go out and see what's going on, and see if some of these meow house people are coming here. After all, what sound does a French cat make? Meow.
Meow.
What? Meow. It's like, I can't do it. I can't do Beaubourg. I can't do French cat. I think this is really going to be a great new thing in Europe. That's going to be when people are really starting to get involved with pop-up venues and shows and all that. It may be the end of art as we know it. But we could go to them and we could say, you call this art? You call this art? You have to see corners for it to be art. You have to see a frame. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, thank you
for
for
letting
being here.
my friend come. Richard, thank you for letting me come to your site-specific lecture on the village. Not site-specific work, I'm so sorry. The piece you're making in the south of France.
Yeah. What Alanna is saying is really interesting to me. Definitions change. The definition of art constantly changes. In the 70s, the young artists of the 70s talked about not the generation right older than us, but two generations. I remember we talked about the silver-haired sculptors. Right? Well, we're all silver-haired sculptors now.
You're just lucky to have hair.
But I mean, the point is that nobody, we knew that the generations of artists older than us couldn't understand our work. But that's the position that we're in now. And what's really interesting to me is that that's a good thing. It's inevitable that you can't really understand more than 2 or 3 generations of art, because it's too far away from you. And I asked Alanna a few years ago how she escaped that, because she's shown, let's say, 4 or 5 generations of young artists, because an art generation is about 5 years. And how could you, and shows them well, and that is chooses them well. And I said, how do you do that? She said, I hire young curators.
And then
Curators
then I go with them.
Yeah, and curators who live that art, who are part of that generation. And she listens to them.
The Ahern pieces that you were showing, there's John Ahern, who Casper loved, I like a lot. And then there's Charlie Ahern, who's the filmmaker.
Yeah.
But I hired Joe Ahern, who's the son, and an organizer of music houses in Brooklyn, and he's been my curator. We go all over the place, and he takes me places, so I get to see this. It's, in the 70s, remember that not only in Paris, but nowhere in New York were people showing videos. The only person in New York who was trying to show videos was Ileana Sonnabend. And the only person in Paris, I think, were the Germans, who were showing, like Vito Acconci and all this difficult work. They were just considered mad. Ileana was considered decadent. And now, our whole world is shaped by film as video in our homes. We can't imagine that. So this is going to be changes in the next couple of years.
Actually, the Biennale de Paris was quite important for video art in 1975 and 1977, and working with Alanna Heiss. So there was, like video, there was this moment in Paris where there was a huge section for video art with Vito Acconci. And
What's it like not ever having met any of the people you love so much? Vito, all these artists that you know so well, but you're too young, you've never met them.
I met Vito Acconci.
Oh, good.
Like 10 years ago, maybe? Yeah, 10. But that's not the topic of today.
No, okay, I just wondered what it's like to not ever know these artists you love. I suppose it's like loving Turner.
Well,
or Matisse, or Manet, not Monet, of course.
any other question?
Well, I don't know,
I
it's
think
8 o'clock. I do have questions, but I think maybe we can, I don't want to monopolize because...
Oh, please ask some questions you have. Like, why
Well, I really, thank you, Pauline, for showing these video extracts, and I was just really triggered by this formula by Keith Haring saying that the only difference between the subway and the museum are that the walls are clean. And then you said about words being like chains, and I've like walls, white walls. Your work, Richard Nonas, how does it fit in a Biennale? Was the only reason you didn't get to be part of the Paris Biennale that you were too old, or is it that your kind of work doesn't fit into museums or walls because they do? I don't know. I was listening to I really appreciated when you were speaking about the place and also about change, how things change and everywhere, and how they imply different factors, or it's a very bad word, but people and places and traditions and customs and context and geography and energy and everything, and then you have these white walls, and so how do you relate to that?
Well, first of all, artists have always hated the white walls. Since the 70s. That one of the reasons Alanna was so successful in attracting people, artists who wanted to work with her, is because Alanna never had a white wall. She never had a wall that wasn't filthy, and a floor that was broken in any of the places until the last 10 years of PS1, and that changed PS1 in many people's mind. It became part of the enemy.
Yes, it wasn't just the merger with MoMA in 2000, which I still think is one of the most interesting things I ever did in my life, and I just love the whole challenge of coming from the arguably, well, certainly the largest, but arguably the most radical art space in the world. That wouldn't be true now, but anyway, to merge with arguably the museum with the best collection in the world, and of course the idea of a non-collecting institution merging with a collecting institution made it morally possible. But I also was interested in the clash between those two and seeing if the power on one side could outlast the power on the other, and this whole thing, and stayed, what, for 10 years with MoMA. And I've lost myself with where I was going. But the thing is that Klaus Biesenbach, my protege friend, good friend, and the current director who I admire very much, had to make it completely his space. And we've worked together for 20 years, and he's very, very, very clean, very, very, very neat. He's like German neat, right? So PS1 is really clean, and there are white walls everywhere. And of course, there's climate control, which I fought my whole life, and now they have it. But that's not Klaus's fault. He hates climate control. So Richard and I are going out as my best friend to see about the 40th anniversary show, and what pieces we could select that would be very good memorials to our whole future and past. And Richard comes in, he looks at all the walls, he said, Alanna, we can't do anything here. We can't show any of those pieces, the walls are too white. We'll have to go somewhere else. And then I said, Richard, that's ridiculous. We're celebrating PS1, and Klaus comes down and he has a German accent when he gets annoyed. And he said, so what is it, Richard? And Richard said, we just got to go somewhere where there's no white walls. I suppose we could throw things at them. I mean, it gets become very awkward when you think that you have to destroy your own white walls, and that's a stupid way to waste money, So obviously we went ahead. And Richard's piece, he decided to do the same piece that he did in rooms, but he decided to do it.
I should have brought the
That's
picture.
it, in the first show. And he decided to do it again and face the challenge of the beautiful white walls. And he did it. It looked beautiful, by the way.
Yeah, but they're different. Two different pieces.
The context is very
Exactly
different.
the same dimensions, same.
Exactly the placement. I mean, it was the floor above, floor below, but you said
Yeah, but it's not just. I mean, it's not just the white walls. It's that in the 70s for all of us, I think, the fact that we were outside of the institutions, outside of the organized art world, we were making our own art world, was really important. But inevitably, what happens is that new guerrilla art world becomes the new institution, and it took a number of years, but that certainly happened. So now the younger artists have to find another way to attack the institution, so to speak. It's like children.
I just don't think that's true, Richard. I think that everybody wants to see young artists and be with young artists. I mean, I found it very boring after 2000, I mean, constantly I would go to these Museum of Modern Art board meetings, and afterwards collector trustees would come racing up to me and saying, oh, Alanna, we want so much to spend time with you, and we want to be able to see some of those young artists. And at first I thought they were just trying to be nice to me or something. Then I thought, well, they just don't know how old I am, and they don't know who my friends are. And then finally I realized they didn't care. They wanted to meet young artists, because that's where it's at right now in New York and collecting. People don't want to see old artists. They want to see young artists, Richard.
But also in 70s. But now we're the old artists.
They never wanted to see us, so that's just the end of it. They didn't want to see us when we were young, and they don't want to see us now that we're old. I mean,
I'll tell you,
not me, of course. I want to see young artists.
Alanna and I spent the morning seeing an old friend of mine, Ramucho Mata, and who was half-brother to Gordon, who was a very close friend of ours. And I remember Gordon, right after Gordon Mata Clark died, there was the first really big museum show, and at the Brooklyn Museum. And just before it opened, a man came in and said, didn't really introduce himself, but we knew who he was. It was Noguchi, Isamo Noguchi, the great sculptor, but who had in fact been involved in raising Gordon. When Mata left,
I had
Gordon's
no
mother,
idea until this morning about that.
Yeah, well, yeah, no, but Gordon talked about it. But when Mata left Gordon's mother, his first wife, he basically asked his friend Noguchi to take care of of the kids, the twins, Gordon and his twin brother. And so he was very much part of Gordon's life for the first, I don't know, 8, 10 years or something like that. But he came after Gordon's death, and he basically asked for somebody to take him around the show before it opened. It was a few hours before the opening, and I was the one who was there. And I took him around. He said, "Tell me about each piece." He wanted to. He understood that he didn't understand, in a very real sense, and he wanted to hear a friend of Gordon's talk about how Gordon would have talked about each of those pieces. You know, through the whole show.
That's a really
It was
interesting
a very
story.
moving experience for me.
He's lucky he got you, Richard, instead of
I
one of
know,
those.
But the interesting thing today, we had lunch with Gordon's half-brother, who said, no, actually, Noguchi did understand the work, but from a distance, and he just wanted to hear it. Yeah.
Do you have any more questions, Elisa, because you brought us all together?
We can continue. I think this is a wonderful ending. Questions that understand, don't understand.
There's the Gordon Matter Clark exhibition that is opening soon in Paris at the Jeux de Paume as well.
And one other thing, talking about generations, when Alanna made the deal with MoMA, I may be misremembering the story you told me, but she basically made two demands of the director of Musée Biennale. And one of them was that she had to have the title of Associate Director of the Museum of Modern
Deputy
Art.
director.
Okay. Wrong? Oh, Deputy
Director.
Deputy Director of the Museum of Modern Art. For one important reason, that she had to be she could not be on the same level of the Museum of Modern Art curators who had treated her like shit for the last 20 years. So she had to be in a high position in them. And
I didn't want to be just amusing anymore.
yeah. And so that generational difference between curators is the same as generational difference between artists. There's a real different way of seeing and understanding the world. And there's no way out of that. I mean, you're stuck in your generation. You can maybe fudge a generation and a half on either side, but not much more. And there's no way you can make up for that. There's no way you can have the intimate knowledge of that generation of art, of makers and of curators, unless you're from that generation.
Well, and we're very grateful that you were able to be here today and share all your experiences from the 70s and 80s with us today. So thank you very much again for coming all the way from New York. And thank you.
This is a comment after the whole thing is over. By the way, James Bishop, who was mentioned twice, a very reclusive American artist who lives in Blévis outside of Paris, about 2 hours near shot. He's a very close friend, but I haven't seen him in many years. And a young French person here and is going to drive me on Saturday to go see him. So I'll see him. He's over 90 years old. So I'm really excited about it, to see what he's doing. We know he's not making any paintings because he thinks that there are too many paintings around now. Too many paintings.
Merci à tous. Et la prochaine séance, c'est le 12 juin.
La prochaine et dernière séance, c'est le 12 juin. On va changer de contexte, ça va être sur l'Espagne totalitaire et la Pologne communiste.